Yeah, of
You know,
course.
no, it was about 30
Okay,
years
I
ago.
will start. I wanted to briefly introduce Professor Stephen Moore. Stephen is Bartlett Koch Regents Professor of Architecture and Planning at the University of Texas at Austin, where he teaches design and interdisciplinary courses related to philosophy, history, and application of sustainable technology. He's also director of the graduate program in sustainable design, and he's co-founder of the Center for Sustainable Development, both at UT at Austin. Professor Moore is a fellow of the National Endowment for the Arts, a Loeb Fellow here at GSD, and the recipient of the Individual Scholar Award from the National Science Foundation. Early in his career, he actually practiced architecture in his own studio in Maine and received numerous regional and national design awards. Then in 1993, he decided to return to graduate school to pursue his PhD at Texas A&M, in which he explored the relationship between critical regionalism and sustainable architecture. And I think this work was the background for his first book, The Technology in Place, Sustainable Architecture and the Blueprint Farm. And since then, Stephen Moore has authored many articles, books, and chapters of books on the topic of sustainable architecture and urbanism. Among them, The Alternative Routes to the Sustainable City and Pragmatic Sustainability, Theoretical and Practical Tools. And these books and his research explore the many and still evolving definitions of sustainability and the different and often competing technological cultures that affect the way in which this concept has been implemented in different contexts across different scales. They address the tension between local perspectives and the tendency to search for universal standards for sustainable development. Stephen Moore's most recent book was co-authored with Barbara Wilson and is entitled Questioning Architectural Judgment, The Problems of Codes in the United States. It reconsiders the lenses through which we judge architecture, what aesthetic or performative criteria we use, and most importantly, to me, questions the nature and stability of the socio-political frames, and I use the concept that you're using, within which we interpret reality and ultimately construct the standards that we set for the built environment. And one of the important issues that, to me, emerged from this reading is that, to use the author's words, it is not simply a matter of designing better, more efficient, or more stringent codes to guide placemaking, but a matter of reconstructing the boundaries of the systems to be coded. And we could add of the networks of involved actors. And if, as architects, we feel constantly threatened by the growing numbers of regulations and ordinances, according to the authors, the opportunities for architects to actually expand very definition of design beyond material composition and embrace this code making as a collective, politically significant act. So, as intimidating or even boring it might sound to many of us, code making seems one way to take architecture beyond an isolated art of making design objects or a form of financial investment. And here, code making, I mean in a broad sense, as we've seen it today throughout the presentations. It's a way to avoid losing control of the field to developers, technicians, consultants, or decorators altogether. What reemerges clearly from the book, and I quote, is that codes must constantly evolve in response to changing conditions and goals. Please welcome Professor Stephen Moore.
Thank you. I'm really amazed that there's this many people left in the room. It's been a long day. It's really nice. So first, my thanks to Alexandra and to Giselle. I have to say this has been a really nicely curated set of conversations. It really has, and it's so really moved along nicely from the morning's talks, which are really about data and codes, and the afternoon conversations, which were about places, like really big places that Bill talked about, the very small places right. That Deborah talked about. And so it's really also a real delight to follow Deborah's talk, because I see it really as the perfect setup, because she's argued for how it is that we might learn to forget and to test codes. And I think my job is to try to talk about how those codes were socially constructed in the first place. which is to also then discover the social codes as well as the data codes that lie beneath them, because they're most of the time not apparent at all. So thanks also for mentioning that the last book was co-edited or co-written with Barbara Wilson, who's now at the University of Virginia. And so I'll say that my comments now are largely drawn from that book, but also not quite equally drawn from a new book that'll be out in June, which is a second edition of Pragmatic Sustainability, this time with a new subtitle. So, it's like always with books. In the next one, you try to clean up the mistakes you made in the last one, right? From critique that you get. So that's what, in part, what this book is about. So here's the big overview about what I'd like to talk about. There are 6 assumptions, followed by a verifiable assertion, a proposition, a hypothesis with methods and a taxonomy of codes, which is historical, and 3 findings. This is the kind of title that people in the late 17th and 18th century used to use. It's like the title was more like an abstract. It would be 2 or 3 pages long. So I think I'm going to adopt that process, which I think is really good. I think the other thing I should probably say at the onset, that the work that went into this book was both historical and empirical. In other words, so we did a lot of archival work, we did a lot of work in libraries, but we also did a great deal of work interviewing people who are out there who administer codes and who are the subjects of codes. And we found that often the historical work and the empirical work really did not agree at all. And so that's usually where you find the fun stuff, which is what we did. So with those categories in mind, so I'll start off with the assumptions. So here are the first 2 assumptions. Now, when we get, I will ask you to interrupt. I know it's not very efficient about time, but if you let me get away with all of the assumptions, then everything just follows, and I can say anything I want. Right. So if you want to challenge some of the assumptions, I urge you to do it now, or just forget it. It's just whatever. Okay. So first, technologies emerge not from an a priori list of scientific possibilities, but from human interests. They might have been other than they are. Right? Okay. First one, okay. First one, okay. I could do an applause-o-meter, after each one. Okay, number 2, all technologies catalyze unequal social and environmental effects, whether or not we intend them to do so. Right? Okay, so number 3, emergent technologies like nanotechnology today, or hammers in the Bronze Age, precede the minuet of invention, regulation, counter-invention, and counter-regulation. In other words, there's always a process. Inventions precede any way that we can think about regulating them, and then there's always a process, an attempt to regulate, an attempt to avoid regulation, and this is what drives interests, human interests, in one direction or another. Number 4, regulation is necessary and democratic because choosing a technology is choosing a way of life. In other words, choosing this thing, as we've heard many times today, right, is not a neutral and natural choice, but rather it's choosing a way of living that we have to be either subject to or responsible for after we buy it. That's a Langdon Winter quote.
Couldn't the flip be said, though, that way of life determines?
Absolutely. So what I'm going to argue in the end is that these things are co-constructed. And it's the degree to which we're conscious of that is what's really important. So you already beat my punchline. That's the end of lecture. Okay, so 5. Architecture can be productively interpreted through the philosophy of technology or science and technology studies rather than only through the philosophy of art. So what I've been arguing for about 25 or 30 years is that interpreting architecture over and over again through the lenses of art has tended to blind us from other possibilities or other consequences of building in a particular way. And please don't leave this room saying Stephen Moore said that art history is bunk. That's not what I'm saying at all. Right? Whether I'm arguing is that it's simply only one lens of many others that we might use. Okay? And number 6, the regulation of architecture is design, the process by which we transform existing conditions into preferred ones. Or another simpler way of saying it is that regulation is design. Right? So my definition of design is from Herb Simon, who's one of my favorite engineers, social anthropologists, sociologists. Okay, so those are my assumptions. So all of the things follow from here. Here's the verifiable assertion. The production and operation of architecture is responsible for about 40% of annual U.S. energy consumption and about 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. We've been through those numbers many of times. So it places a particular responsibility on architectural production and consumption. So out of that assertion comes a proposition. If technologies have unequal effects, and architecture is a technology with both positive and negative effects, then it will be helpful to us to understand how architecture is regulated so that the positive and negative effects might be equitably distributed. I think that this is something we, by and large, forget to talk about. And because we tend not to keep track of the positive and negative effects of the built environment. In other words, we're so busy talking about art, we don't talk, we don't measure, we don't consider what the consequences are of how we build. So that's a proposition followed by a hypothesis. Technological codes are both an index of changing social values and a strategy to enforce those values. Now, when I say something like this to the code enforcement officer of Austin, you just get, of course, a blank stare because they are trained to be convinced and are themselves convinced that codes are perfectly empirically derived, scientifically provable regulations. Because if they were to allow any subjective interpretation of the code, they couldn't justify getting paid at the end of the week. So the entire culture of code enforcement depends upon understanding codes as scientifically derived. And of course, that is true when you talk about something like the strength of materials, like the stones in your wall. Right? You can prove, okay, that a piece of granite of a certain geological content can withstand certain compressive or tension forces. But that's not quite true. Because when you really look at the codes derived from empirical analysis, there's this little thing called the safety factor. Right? And what is the safety factor? And in the US, for most conditions, the safety factor is 250%. Now, how do we decide that 250% is the appropriate safety factor? When our understanding of molecular structure and our ability to test things, why not 10%? Why not 100%? Why not 113.7%? Why 250%? Pardon me?
Insurance companies?
Yeah, yes. Well,
Risk.
yeah, sure. It's about the value of human life.
Right.
It's not something that we will take risks with. Now, there is actually under consideration in certain engineering circles the probability of reducing factor of safety, right? But can you imagine this conversation? It'll be really interesting, right? Okay, so in other words, my digression here is really about to demonstrate that our codes and ordinances are really social judgments. They are not purely technological judgments, right? That we have a responsibility to uphold the public health, safety, and welfare, which is why architects and engineers have a license to practice. We have a kind of monopoly to build, to design things that other walks of life, other professions can't do. And in exchange for that limited monopoly, we are required to uphold the public health, safety, and welfare. The problem is that we do it so minimally. We do it to exactly the code, which means that if we were to build any less badly, we would be criminals. So just, this is a significant philosophical question. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. A sub-hypothesis then would be that technological coding is the highly social process through which relevant social groups delimit what can and cannot be delivered. Who gets to determine what the values are by which any code is implemented? This is the position of power that Bill was talking about just a minute ago, right? Whose power, what kind of power, right? And who are the relevant social groups that get to make those decisions? Technological codes of all kinds attempt to modify the world in the name of progress. In other words, part of modernity, right, is always the assumption that we will make things better. It's a constantly changing platform in which better technologies will improve the likelihood that we're going to arrive at the Enlightenment project of health, safety, and welfare for all. Right? So that's the nature of codes, which is why codes continue to change, right? And why they change in relationship to socially constructed values. The problem is that all of those things are completely under the surface. Right? Just as, I guess it was Bill who argued that it's the attorneys who don't want to change real estate laws, right? Because it's in their interest not to. Right? Okay, so here comes then the more technical part of the talk, and in the interest of time, I will probably go through some of this rather quickly. And so this is the part of the talk that is both historical and empirical. So there's a taxonomy, which Barbara and I created ourselves, of existing code types. And these are ideal types that are out there that are often applied by different societies at different times. And they're not historical in the sense that one comes after the other. They're more geo-historical, which is to say that all of them exist now in different places and at different times. So those are tacit codes, sumptuary codes, which I'll define in a minute, economic codes, of which there are 3 subtypes: prescriptive, incentive, and performance codes, and what I now like to call eco-socio-technical codes. So it'll take a moment to get to that. So I'm going to go through each of these types, albeit pretty briefly, so we can get up to the end. Now, to do this, the way that our method of analysis is that in each case, when we thought we had a nominee for a code type, we said, okay, what are the units of analysis that we would use for all code types? And then we would then analyze each code type in terms of that unit of analysis. So the unit of analysis was always strategy, which is, how did the code work to produce certain effects? What's the frame of understanding or the frame of perception used by the social group to define their interests? There's a long literature beginning with Irving Goffman in 1973, and from STS studies, which is Wiebe Bijker and others from STS literature, we would develop an example of it, how those codes work to modify human behavior, because that's, of course, what codes are always interested in doing, right? It's not about the materials so much as it is about human behavior in how it's engaging those materials. And then lastly, what's the kind of authority or the type of authority required to operationalize each code type? So we did this originally for about 20 different code types, and we ended up coming back to the 5 with some subtypes. Right? The original first articles that came out of this work were incredibly confusing and really terribly written, I have to say. Okay, so we'll start with tacit codes. Now, everybody thinks that this term was used a half an hour ago. Somebody used it. And everybody thinks we know what tacit codes are, and these are codes that are a part of history. We no longer have tacit codes. Well, I beg to differ quite. We have lots of tacit codes that are used every day. But I'll say tacit codes are basically, the strategy is that they're practice-based. In other words, we don't think so much about what we do, we just do what we do. And we do what we do because we are who we are. Right? So if you're from New England this way, or originally from actually the Midwest, this is the way you build because this is who we are. This is the society of agreements about how we build a house. And that way of understanding is really a frame of understanding the world is cosmological. It's about the order of things in the world. And they work by ordering the material and social processes of building, right? That these things are not different, they're really one thing. And it's a kind of a theocratic authority that makes that kind of coding work. The second is sumptuary codes. Now, sumptuary codes, if the root word, of course, is consumption, and so what sumptuary codes have been explicitly used really since China in about the 11th century, England in the 14th, 15th century, and so sumptuary codes are always about limiting the kinds of consumption that one class of people can do, or maybe all classes of people, or requiring certain kinds of consumption by other groups. Now, the easiest and most fun example is this guy right here. Right? So that's a 15th century England. And this is under, 16th century, which is Queen Elizabeth I. And Queen Elizabeth I had a particular penchant for wanting to know who was out there. If you walked out the door out of, I don't know if Buckingham Palace was built yet, but if you walked out her door, what you wanted to be able to do was to look out on the citizenry and tell that by the cut of a sleeve, right, or the color of a cloak, or the certain kind of material, that all of those things were linked to class designations. In other words, and there were elaborate code books that were called the Taylor's code books that allowed you to wear a certain kind of clothing, and there were fines for violating the code. So it's about, we had a reference earlier to Seeing Like a State, Geoffrey Scott's nice book. James Scott, nice book. Well, this is the original version of that, right? In other words, what the state wanted to be able to see was who and what class rank, right? So you can apply exactly the same kind of reasoning to the classical orders, because if you read Claude Perrault clearly, each order should be applied to certain buildings of a certain category of social prestige or be inhabited by persons of a certain social prestige. So it was a way of being able to read the city, just like we could read it through clothing, we could read it through this way. Well, okay, so that comes to America in the terms of the pattern books, particularly those by Andrew Jackson Downing and a few others, which if you actually sit down and read them, this is in 19th century America, which we imagine to be highly democratic and aspiring to democratic measures. These were remarkably classist in their orientation, and that this building was appropriate to be lived in by country gentlemen who had some business interests. That's almost a direct quote, right? And so other styles were associated with other walks of life. Okay, so my big point here is that LEED and the Green Globe Initiative and the Sustainable Sites Initiative, which comes out of my school, these also are sumptuary codes. In other words, that consuming materials or consuming energy or consuming water, consuming many other things, right, is a practice which we now frown on because it's in the better social good that the less of those things we consume, the higher our status is in terms of the moral economy of the state. And so being able to exhibit a bronze plaque on your building that's either LEED or Green Globes is becoming a very significant, real social significance, but as Liz will tell you, it's also in real estate value, right? The real estate value now goes up. So sumptuary codes, which I would be happy to talk about for another 4 hours, are very much still with us, as are tacit codes. Okay, so we'll go to economic codes, the first subcategory being prescriptive codes. Some of you will undoubtedly know of Bruno Latour's wonderful essay about the door closer, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's really very good. It's written under a pseudonym, one of his first major essays in the 1970s. And basically, he has this very wonderful little line in it, is that the reason we have door closers is because we can't really afford to have a fire marshal, at every corridor door to keep the door closed in case of fire. So what we've done is to fabricate little tiny fire marshals that are inside the door closer, which opens and closes the door, right? So agency, right, of the technocracy has been transferred from the fire marshal's office to the mechanical apparatus that's in the door. So it's prescriptive. In other words, it says it's thou must close the door. You don't have a choice. It's a technological frame because it takes agency away from humans, and it works by relocating human agency into artifacts themselves, and it's very much a command and control form of governance. A second kind of economic coding is, we've already been here today too, to talk about incentive codes. In other words, Bill talked about these, that if we want a developer in public-private partnerships, if we want a developer to provide some public amenity, and the code says that they can only build to that point, right? We say, well, if you build also a public park and some swimming pools, we'll let you build that tall. Okay, so this is a case in which incentive codes were used in a UN World Heritage Site for these buildings. This is in the city of Manchester, and it still is, after actually 20 years later, a major public outcry about what citizens consider to be the illegal use of incentivizing capital investment for the interests of government and government leaders rather than people. So incentive coding you can see as one kind of illegitimate economic coding. So it's really, done in the frame of the entrepreneur. It's about density in this case, and it works by rewarding risk takers, and it's done, initiated by the regime of liberal capitalism. Far more interesting, in my view at the moment, is really performance codes. So this picture right here happens to be the Commerzbank Frankfurt, which is a Foster and Partners project. Performance codes basically are now written into almost all codes. Probably everybody knows this, right? There's a little sentence at the back of each code which says that here's a prescriptive code, but if you can through engineering methods demonstrate that you can deliver the same amount of performance with other that also has other benefits, we will allow this. As an exception to the prescriptive code. And so it's about being able to demonstrate performance through manipulation of technological apparatus and data manipulation. Right? And so it's about a consequential ethic. In other words, it's always about outcomes, not about standards, which is enormously important. And in my view, a step in the right direction. This is an example of smoke exhaust in this central atrium, which I won't bore you with the details are. But here, instead of rewarding economic risk-taking, here it's really about rewarding creativity, right? In other words, if you can find a better way to do it, authority says, great, we're all for it. The problem, however, is that you have to have access to substantial economic means to be able to prove the performance standard. So in the end, although it's a step in the right direction, it still leads us away from social equity in code making. And so I would say that this is a very pragmatic kind of authority, which has been, which we're moving towards, I think. Which leads us here to the end. I'm rushing a little bit, but so I'll make an argument now for eco-socio-technical codes. So one part of the story behind this is that when I dreamed up this wonderful word, I've always wanted to speak German, because in German, you can put all the words together that you ever want to do, and it's perfectly okay. In English, you can't do that, and somebody told me that I should never put this in print, but I have.
One word.
Yeah, eco-socio-technical is one word.
Code.
Yeah. Oh, and I should put the code too. Oh, thank you. Yes, actually, you're right. I've missed an opportunity. When I said to Barbara Wilson that I've invented this wonderful word, and she just looked at me with kind of a disdainful face, and she said, Stephen, we've had such codes like this since the 1970s. You're talking about ADA. And I went, yeah. Actually, you're right. Because what such codes are about is to integrating multiple possibilities or multiple categories of goodness or of social goodness. So it's the difference between, of course, this rather beautiful integrated ramp that does many things as opposed to this thing. Right? And so it looks at multiple possibilities of solving social and technological problems. And here it's also the Alley Flat Initiative, which is this project, which is a project I've been working on for about 10 years, which I won't tell you about, which is about affordable housing in very vulnerable Latino neighborhoods in Austin. And they work by integrating social desires with ecological benefit and technological change. Now, if you actually sit back and think about that as a way of designing a code, other possibilities begin to emerge, right? But I think it took us quite some time to try to understand just how the kind of authority behind this kind of code making is inherently democratic, as opposed to technocratic, as opposed to economic or tacit. Right? Okay, so here's the whole semester, and I won't give you. Everybody take out a piece of paper, and I'll give you the test, right? The quiz. But just a couple of things. Okay, so there's just 3 findings, and then we can have some conversation. Tacit, sumptuary, and economic codes tend to ignore or suppress social and ecological effects. In other words, they depend on other kinds of authority to suppress the very existence of social and ecological consequences. In other words, because they say it's really about other things. Right? So that's a problem, in my view, with those kinds of code. In other words, they're inherently undemocratic codes, in my view. So 2, here's an example of mass design, which are graduates from this school, I'm sure everybody knows, and the graduates wrote a guideline for exceptional health infrastructure worldwide. So they wrote a code. And eco-socio-technical codes are inherently more democratic and effective, I'll argue, because they at least attempt to make explicit the likely social and or ecological effects of technological change, and they also attempt to distribute risk equally. Right? And so the distribution of risk is one of the reasons why we have high safety factors. And so in thinking through those kinds of issues, it's like, who should we distribute risk to? In what areas? Right? So in the neighborhoods I've been working on in East Austin, it's a classical case of environmental racism and all kinds of problems that are really driven by a code written in 1928 by engineers. That was only challenged in 1978 after most of the damage had already been done. Right? And so trying to rework those codes in a way that's eco-socio-technical in orientation is probably not something we'll achieve in the next year, but we're working on it. And so 3, in postmodern technoscience and architecture, the role of the expert needs to change. So this is the kind of thing I always tell students that you should never do, which is to put in any text, people should do this. But I am making the argument that here's something that we should do. That the role of experts in a democratic society, as opposed to a technocratic one or an oligarchic one, is not to tell citizens how to live, but to provide the information required for them to make informed choices. In other words, I think some of the participatory work that we saw today was an example of that, of working, providing the information about beauty, about performance, about economy. So I'm delighted to see some of that work going on. But I'm going to argue that the change role of architects and planners in this way, which is consistent with the doctrines of participatory action research or public interest design, or whatever you would like to call it, is both an ethical and an epistemological requirement to incorporate the history, the experience, and the values of communities in knowledge production. And I'll say that design is one kind of knowledge production. And if we can recognize that at the beginning, all technological codes are codes of values, and they have always been that, why aren't we including the values of the people who are most vulnerable to the places that we built? So I'll stop there, and maybe we can have some conversation.
I just had a question. How would you characterize inclusionary housing codes?
Well, it depends if you. I'm pleased that you asked, because actually I live in Texas, right? Okay, so inclusionary housing codes are illegal statewide. But one of the ways that we're working to try to overcome the state legislation is that over a period of about 10 years, finally through the work of one heroic congressperson, we have created colonial, I'm losing the word, but homestead districts. And so homestead districts are districts that have historically been either African American or Latino or white. It could work any way. And in those homestead districts, the argument is to preserve cultural continuity that you can require affordable housing or housing at certain rates, and it has the same impact. But basically, in the end, I'm very much for inclusionary housing, which is part of what actually the Alley Flat or ADU project that I've been working on is all about too. Yes.
It's in relation to some of the conversations that were happening in the morning session about the role of the user. I was curious about where you would stand in terms of where the user fits, in terms of the laity that basically will receive whatever the code maker makes, and the code maker themselves as the user. Where do you see the code maker as the user in the complexities of the different findings that you have in the different codes?
Thank you. That's the perfect question. Okay, so we live in a democracy, right? Legislation is supposedly made by the citizens, or it's made at the behest of citizens by legislators. Laws are codes. So, in other words, the fundamental idea is that citizens make the codes. So, as professionals, my argument has been for a long time is that we should be working in neighborhoods to make their own codes. And that citizens should become code makers in a far more visible and proactive way. So that's what some of the projects that we've been working on are all about. In other words, how do you make the codes explicit? How do you make the consequences of the technical codes explicit to people in a way that's readable, right? And if you can do that, you find that people who live in the neighborhoods, they know the neighborhood vastly better than the code makers, right? What code makers know is about abstract standards that exist someplace else. What neighbors know is about what works and what doesn't work in a particular neighborhood based upon empirical evidence, right? So if they're not involved in the making of the code, it's just stupid.
I have a question. In a way, one could say that making a code or designing a new code is a very expensive undertaking. We were talking with Liz before about certain things that even a city like Los Angeles cannot afford doing. So when we think about a small community or a neighborhood, it's probably even more difficult. And on the other hand, it's also very risky to introduce new rules that are not following certain standards. So it's difficult to have insurance for that, right? Not everybody can afford that.
Yes.
Well, how do you deal with that when you actually try to advocate for coding?
Actually,
locally?
that's another absolutely key question. So one of the things we found in our empirical analysis is there tend to be leader cities and follower cities in regions, right? Because codes tend to be often regional. If you remember, before the universal building codes, each region of the United States had its own code, which was largely climatically driven. So that's not the case anymore. But I've lost the strain of your question because I diverted. Okay, so give it to me again.
I was asking about the economic aspect of the.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so there are leader cities and follower cities. Okay, so leader cities tend to adopt risky codes because they're bigger, and cities like Boulder, Austin, Seattle, Vancouver, Boston to some extent, are big enough and educated enough that they tend to test and create their own codes, which I would argue is one of the primary responsibilities of all municipalities, an issue which goes back to the Constitution itself. But that's another time. Okay, so cities within regions tend to follow the leader cities, but not be quite as risky because they don't want to take as much risk. One of the things that's on the table now is that cities are talking about self-insuring. So that if you can self-insure against code or catastrophes or collapses, right, the losses could be dramatically less. And I would say that that's an inherently democratic idea. In the framing of the Constitution, what the forefathers had to say was the large argument between constitutionalists and anti-constitutionalists. In other words, the Madisonians and the Jeffersonians, right? Where would the ability to test and innovate come from, right? So, interestingly enough, the Hamiltonians, who were the people who wanted to be able to, for economy to be able to change rapidly, didn't want government telling them what to do. But they also were smart enough. It's the only time in my life I've come across with the right wing. Right? What they were smart enough to understand is that if cities could reserve the right to change codes at their level, at that unit of space, it would hasten cycles of innovation. Right? But what's happened is that municipalities tend not to take that responsibility. So an argument that we make in the first book is that it's really important that universities and cities team up to test new possibilities that are uniquely adapted to the technological, ecological, and cultural character of particular places. Because in that way, as we will get not only economies of scale and innovation, but also get differentiation of place, right? And so if that happens at the local scale, right, so that planning is not something that happens every 20 years when cycles of housing boom and bust, right? But if planning is something that goes on, and planning largely, but also planning in terms of technological codes, happens constantly, so that you begin to build a repository of information and data and experience about experimentation. If that happens all of the time, in the end, it will be less costly. And just one example. So in Austin is the perfect example of the opposite, right? Being Texas, we go through these wild swings of boom, boom, and bust. And so what does the city do? At the beginning of a cycle, we hire a whole bunch of new planners who are new graduates from my school, right? Which is great for the school, right? Until the economy begins to go south, and then they fire them all. And then they go to work in Boston or someplace, and the entire body of knowledge created in that swing is completely lost, right? And the cost to rebuild that knowledge is huge, right? So it's a false economy in the end. Right? So sorry, yeah.
I have a question historical, which is why this frame of
A generation.
arrived and how did it get Canada?
Frame of 20 years for.
Planning
Plan
horizon,
updates.
a planning horizon.
Well, that's actually not the case. It depends on what you're looking at, right? In terms of smaller architectural codes, planning revisions, codes are made every 3 years by groups of public-private partnerships. But those codes are not made by government. They're actually made by the industry. You could say that historically, cities do codes every 20 years. But I think that that's actually a myth. The city of Austin just did a code that was finished in 2012. The code they did before that was 1978. And there are lots and lots of cities out there like that. right. And so I think that there's this kind of idea that 20 years is about right. But if you look at cities that are growing quickly, or those that are not, that are actually getting smaller or staying about the same, I don't think that there really is a standard. A question over here?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Alexa is going to direct traffic, right? Right. Sorry. Oh, right.
So thanks for your talk. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I think you're absolutely right that we need to look at architecture not just from a history of art point of view, but an SDS code. Of course, definitely all these codes have social. But I guess I do want to kind of maybe defend a little bit the old-fashioned. I mean, kind of the old-fashioned notion of code is actually being prescriptive. As opposed to yeah, that we could kind of generate them at the community level. And I don't know how to articulate this, but I guess I would just kind of maybe just suggest that that's kind of the world we live in, for better or worse. I'm not sure if you could really sort of generate codes at that sort of grassroots level. Kind of my intuition, maybe I can't. I think the prescriptive, prescriptive codes actually, maybe they are the best answer. And we shouldn't maybe be too dismissive, even though they are certainly rigid and lacking in sort of nuance or creativity.
I didn't mean to be dismissive. Maybe it sounds funnier when you are or something, but I did mean to be entirely dismissive of prescriptive codes because, hey, we're dealing with people's lives here in many cases. So, yeah, I think you're right. But the problem from an STS perspective is that those prescriptive codes also hold up prescriptive relationships of power that go unexamined.
Oh, definitely. But then maybe the solution is to try to change them, to leave them, to try to change them. They can still be prescriptive, but to try to change them by understanding those relations.
I agree. Okay. And then there's, sorry, maybe the first that was up, he was up there first. Right. Hey.
Well, I think in reference to that, I think another word for International Building Code is the International Building Code, well, the code of U.S. and Canada. So that's just one point. But this is just a general comment. Thanks for the conference. I did a MArch thesis on codes, which,
Hey.
think about that.
Congratulations.
So I feel like this conference was just for me, so thank you. But a general comment would be, I think, if I could pull out one thing, it would be that I think that the general idea of codes right now, or maybe in this room, is that is of code as government as powerful stranger. And I think that one thing that I think all of these presentations have showed is that it's not always government. I mean, I think in what Benjamin has alluded to is that codes can and do exist supra-governmentally, infra-governmentally, and even while they are powerful, they don't necessarily stem from powerful means of reasoning. And even when they are government, they don't have to be strangers. And it seems to me that is a way of explicitly tying in decoding to coding, because decoding does not necessarily mean to rid of a code. It means to sort of understand the code message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Nice comment. Go ahead, Benjamin.
So, as my question, or for clarification, has to do both with, or maybe as a two-part. One is with the STS angle, which I'm quite sympathetic to, so the anthropology or sociology of code in this context, and the other one has to do with the proposition that you put forth about the way and this is sort of the clarification about the importance or predominance that a more local scale or focus should have on the health of the system and its capacity to innovate and to do so, sort of intelligence at the margins, right? A kind of almost Hayek, Cadillac-y kind of argument in a way. So the first one has to do with, on the one hand, I took it to mean that the STS argument is that by definition, almost a priori, any form of way in which we would build cities and make these durable assemblages and housing and architecture is already immediately full of social choices, values, norms. It can't not be, right? It's deeply, almost over-invested and over-determined by those range of choices in this way. And then at the same time, it seems that you're arguing that what we need to do, the problem is that, and so it's full of social values. This is full of it. At the same time, the problem with the codes and the buildings and the cities we make is they're not invested with the social values of the local communities or the social values of their users or the social values who want to do. And so they're, in a way, empty of the social values and so they need to be filled up in such a way. And I wonder whether it's possible to argue that they're both overdetermined and underdetermined at the same time. And I don't know whether it's possible, or if it is, it would take some maneuver. The other question to do with the localism, the local question here as well, is that I guess sort of pulling on that second one, it's like it's always determined in some sort of way, or in this way. An example that you used about the environmental example that you were talking about in community, which you obviously know much more about than I do, that you was a classical example of environmental racism, where you've got this code from 1928, and you said it had been written by engineers and hadn't been updated and sort of things like this as well. And I don't know, but the question I would sort of suppose in this way is maybe the problem with this code is not that it was written by some distantiated expert from 1928. It was an engineer who was thinking of this in purely mechanical and abstract levels, but precisely because the effect of the environmental racism is an expression of the local social values or some of the local social values on a certain sort of level, and that it's not a glitch in the system. It's exactly what goes wrong when local social values overdetermine the code in the wrong way or too much, and it's exactly the kind of point when the expert should step in and make prescriptive and universal demands and say and override these values. So anyway, I'm just two
Great.
thoughts.
Thanks very much. That's really good. So I think probably in the future I'll borrow your line about being both over and under determined, because I think you're exactly right. So I think that describes my my assessment of coding at the international level as a kind of technocratic colonialism. And the inability of locals who live in those places to make much change. So over and undetermined, very, very good terms. But I'll go back to the case of Austin, right, again, to talk about the latter case. So in 1928, when the second city plan of Austin was made by a team of engineers, and I admit I come from a long family of engineers, so I tend to use the term very derisively, right? So these were engineers, of course, people who know how to design streets and lighting, but who were taking their spatial cues from the city council. And of course, everyone knew at that time that it was illegal to divide space along racial lines. So the way it was done illegally was through the provisioning of infrastructure. Right, so to either the black community or the Latino community who says, look, if you want to live here, we can't prevent you from doing that, but you're not going to get lights, you're not going to get paved streets, you're not going to get electricity, you're not going to get this, you're not going to get that. But if you move to the separate but equal space of East Austin, we will give you those things, which of course were never delivered. Right. Okay, so you're right. It was the intent of those who were in control of Austin politics to be overtly racist, but they had to do it in a kind of secret way. Okay, so it was about local control, which lasted until the 60s, actually, until local, mostly Latino groups began to work against it. Primarily, these were landfills that started the problem and an oil storage depot. But in the past, well, since the mid-60s, actually some significant gains have been made. But of course, the problem now is that significant gains have been made. It's the invitation for gentrification, right? So, in the end, the answer to your question is that.
But also federal desegregation mandates, I would assume, as well.
Yes, there were for schools. Yes, and the federal mandates for schools was the first thing in the 60s that made it happen, and it was on the tail end of that that a group named Poder was the primary instigator of environmental movement against environmental racism issues. But ultimately, what people have learned to do is, so vulnerable locals have learned how to use data, to use data about technology and about technological change. So in other words, they're becoming skilled at the same game that dominant whites have learned how to, have been playing for a long time. And so I think in the end, my argument is that the responsibility of professionals who have this responsibility to uphold the public health, safety, and welfare is to help smaller groups in distant places to use codes and to use data in a way that's life-enhancing. So I hope that answers the question.
I don't know if I can put this properly, but it's such a rich topic, actually, that in my city, and maybe I'm saying the obvious here, but in my city, codes are the introduction of codes are directly related to poverty, which is very much a colonial situation.
Directly related to what? Sorry.
Poverty.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that nobody said, or let's just take the more obvious, I mean, it's just the same thing. The British situation in Africa was, it didn't say you can't live in the city if you're African. They said if you live in the city, you have a flush toilet and a big lot and a certain kind of house. So, but the thing so that's step one, which is obvious, and that you're using that to power. But I mean, in our city, my own city, it meant that in 1950, 40% of the housing was owner built. In 2000, in 50 years, it was less than 1%. And the newest part of the city, 15 years later, that is the part that's been built since 1950, is now the poverty belt of my city. And so there's something in here. So codes are a huge part of this, and I don't know how to say it properly. You know, we're getting into the whole topic of formal and informal. I just would like to say that I've found working in other places in this life of going back and forth, that even those local people have codes. It's a question of whether you can, and you know, there's a gate there. The gate, it's one of your gateways, I think, the code thing. It works both. It's a manipulative, but everybody has. I had this argument once with somebody who worked for Prince Charles, you know, about he made Poundbury, and he modeled it on English market towns. He said they were fantastic. And I said, well, they're fantastic because they had no fucking codes. No, the people, they had a code, like an anthropological code, but they had no. And he said, well, Poundbury, so he said, well, it's the same as new urbanism. That's exactly the same issue we're talking about here. Because new urbanism went, when he came to my city, he went to the Irish neighborhood called Cabbagetown and said, that's the nicest, most interesting community here, sort of visually. And he could have copied it out there, except that I said, well, that's an interesting place because it it's called Cabbage Town because Irish people came and planted cabbages, first of all, in their lots. And a house was secondary. So some houses are at the back, some were on the side, some were. They had a code, though, of their own. But he said, no, I like the look of it, so we want to copy. He made a huge code. Those fucking, he calls them something else, you know, about the angles of the roof and all the things that have to make it look like, actually make it look like those cities that we love that didn't have codes. Ironically, it's a bizarre kind of go-round that, and I think the last thing I'll say is what we've been interested in my city now is, well, I think we've discovered this, that for every dollar spent on new housing, that is by developers largely, there's $1.50 spent on additions and renovations, according to the building, for people who got a building permit, but it's actually $3.50 to $4 of all the activities actually going on. So it's just, I mean, it's like Uber hitting Toronto, or we're just realizing that we now have two codes, two ways of operating, and actually we're sort of tolerating them, and it's a fascinating kind of situation right now.
Yeah, so another way to say, I'll just interpret what you said. We have always had tacit codes and we've always had explicit codes, and all cities have always had both sets of things. The issue is the degree to which they can be made explicit to understand the values of the code makers. In other words, where does power lie to make codes, and in whose benefit are they? So I'm really shocked that up until your comment, nobody has brought up form-based codes, which is usually the first critique I get, because, you didn't talk about form-based codes. But I would say, actually, so that's another chapter that's one of the problems, is that form-based codes are sumptuary codes. They're just sumptuary codes of a different kind. And so that's a paper that I have to write that I haven't gotten to yet.
Well, one thing I wanted to add too is on this this question about the participatory coding, down to the community level, and whether it's a planned district ordinance done in a subset of the jurisdiction, or I think many of the suburbs, you could say, they're suburbs, the small suburbs. They've formed as incorporated cities in order to control their destiny, right? And you don't have to go back to 1928. You can go back to 2015 to find discriminatory codes where they've done it through large lot zoning, prohibiting any density above, a certain unit count, gated communities, things like that. How do we get around that kind of discrimination that's occurring through the code and reflects local values? It reflects the neighborhood values.
Yeah, well, that's what political organizations exist to do, right? To make those concealed values clear. I'll give you another example from Austin. There was a recent subdivision in the south of Austin, actually outside Austin's jurisdiction, that required that all buildings have limestone facing on them. And it was really very clear that the reason for that is that limestone facing is more expensive, and they didn't want poor people living there. And a group, which included the group Poder that I mentioned before, took them to court and won. Because there was no rational basis for energy saving or any other than economic exclusion. So inclusionary zoning is against the law in Texas, but so is exclusionary zoning against the laws. So they won, which was a good news.
I wanted to propose that we actually move the conversation to the dinner place, so we can have an informal conversation. Maybe continue, yes. Since Matt and Alexa, who have been helping us, we really have to start wrapping up here. I wanted to thank all of you for this incredible conversation, for all your presentations. Carlos, again, for your support and moderating the event. Ghazal for doing it together. It's been great. And to everyone who stayed with us till the last moment. And yeah, I hope we have more occasions to talk about this topic, which actually isn't that boring after all. Thank you.